couple of decades ago, Westside Barbell kind of introduced the lifting world to the idea of accommodating resistance. And that is adding something like bands or chains to your straight weight that will make it more difficult as you get to the easier portion of the lift. Now, this only kind of works for things that get easier as you finish them, like squats, like deadlifts, like bench press. Now, the thing is that for a lot of people, the idea of accommodating resistance kind of only applies to if you're doing equipped powerlifting, which is kind of why they did it, because as you straighten up in the equipment, you lose the assistance of that equipment, and so you want to be stronger in that portion of the lift. The problem is, of course, that not everybody's doing equipped lifting, so does it have relevance? Well, they've done some studies, and I'll see if I can dig these up, and I'll put them on Substack for you. But what's interesting about it is we find that they don't do very well for hypertrophy. They don't do any better for strength, but what they do better for is power. And that applies a lot to us as martial artists. So here's the thing, right? When you have a band, right, it gets more tension the more you stretch it. So at slack, obviously there's no tension. And once it's kind of taut, you have a little bit of tension, but as you stretch it, it runs out of stretch, right? And the further it goes, it runs more and more out of stretch, it gets more resistance. So you're only going to get resistance on the part that, you're only going to get more resistance on the parts that are easier and easier and easier on the lift. Which basically, the reason that helps power is that allows you to continue to develop strength towards the deceleration phase of when you would be doing something. And athletically, doing something like a throw or a punch, you are going to naturally be decelerating a little bit towards the snap, right? Because your body wants to preserve your joints and all of that. So if you know those mechanisms are going to be there, you want a lot of strength on that very end of the end range, and that's where that power comes in. But the other cool thing is that over the long term, it might actually make you a little bit stronger. Probably still not very good for hypertrophy. Briefly, the reason that it's not good for hypertrophy is we now have studies that demonstrate that being at the stretch position, the longer muscle length position, is more hypertrophic than being at the shorter length. Whether it's because it's a weaker position, thus it has to call on more muscle fibers to do the thing. The exact mechanisms are still a little bit unknown. There are some challenges to the research. It's still a developing field of research. But there is some pretty strong evidence, some pretty strong suggestion that another reason to be working full range of motion, or in the case of some people talking about long length partials, there's some evidence suggesting there's another reason that you don't want to be doing little half reps. And if you are going to be doing half reps, do them at the long, hard, difficult muscle lengths. Don't do them at the short muscle lengths where it's easier. So yeah, it's probably not going to give you a huge boost for hypertrophy. It's not going to give you zero. It's just not going to give you optimal and certainly not maximal hypertrophy. But as martial artists, we're a little less worried about it. Hypertrophy is still beneficial, right? Because you want as much of your mass to be muscle tissue, force generating motile tissue and connective tissue, less of it adipose tissue, right? Obviously there's a certain necessary amount of body fat, don't undercut that there. But we want to make sure that we are able to produce power. Well, one of the big things that interferes with power is concurrent or conjugate training, Westside style, right? And I don't know, the research that I've seen, these studies are often so short term. I don't know if this is an interference effect in the sense of your short term ability to produce power, or if this is like a systemic thing. But my assumption is that it's probably a short-term thing due to like fatigue and whatnot. But if you're working on cardio at the same time, it's like the only interference effect we see. There is very, very little interference effect on raw force production or hypertrophy overlapping with cardio. You just put your cardio at the end of your workout or in a separate workout altogether, and you're basically fine. You don't have to worry about the interference effect. It's almost null. However, it does drop power off a little bit. And so you probably want to be maximizing your power training. And so you might consider substituting at least some of your hypertrophy training for power training. And this is, when you're moving heavy loads, you can't always move fast. So there's a term other than power that people will use, which in sports science, it's maximum intent to move. And the idea is you are trying to push that weight as hard, as fast, as explosively as possible, despite the fact that you probably can't. So this applies to squat, bench, and deadlift. Of course, this is definitely going to apply to things like sled pushes and sled drags, but this should apply to bands as well. And now here's the thing, right? You also probably want to kind of have a slowdown on the eccentric phase. And now look, there's some evidence that accentuated eccentrics are going to boost up your fatigue a little bit. It's probably true. But then long muscle length training, which is preferred in hypertrophy, also increases fatigue. And training close to failure also increases, like you can't escape fatigue. You have to manage fatigue. So as long as you're not going overboard and going dumb, doing a very explosive, hard push. And look, use a fairly, a fairly good resistance band, right? You're not going to have exact poundages on this. You don't need exact poundages. You kind of want RPE. You want just rate of perceived exertion. And you want something that you can move quickly with maximum intent to move, but you want it to give you enough resistance that it's actually doing something. You also don't want to be necessarily mimicking your exact skill movements because it's not going to really help your exact skill movements. What you actually want to be looking at is more the overall gross motor pattern of like unilateral pushes, like punching. But you don't necessarily have to be throwing punches with bands. That's probably not a good idea. But doing explosive unilateral moves with the bands is probably a good idea. So that's one of the ways that we can utilize this stuff. And here's the cool thing too. Bands are fairly cheap. Look, they're expensive for what they are. Like they cost money, but they're fairly cheap. Like a good set, when you get pairs of bands that run through the lightest to the heaviest, look, a good set's going to cost you $100, $200 depending on who you buy them from. Or you can get sets of single bands for about $50. They're all over the place on Amazon. Just make sure you're getting, like, unless you have a latex allergy, make sure you're getting like the good rubber latex ones. I haven't seen anything else that's better yet. And bands are absolutely consumable items. Expect you're going to have to replace them about every 2 years. Whenever you anchor them on something smooth and not sharp or rough, because that's going to wear down the life of your bands. Also, don't expose them to direct sunlight. UV radiation does break down the latex. Heat, not so much, but the UV exposure absolutely does. So, I mean, obviously heat to a point will, right? So if you can keep them in a temperature controlled, climate controlled space, that's probably for the best. If you can't, at least keep them out of direct sunlight. Expect to replace them every 2 years, maybe more frequent if you use them more. They should probably not be the bulk of your training. They take quite a bit of setup if you want to use them as proper accommodating resistance, West Side style. That can be a pain, but using them for certain movements, and especially like athletic unilateral movements and whatnot, like unilateral pushing and wood choppers and stuff like that, can be really, really, really useful. Don't sleep on bands. They are extremely useful and they're incredibly portable. So if you really want to get workouts in, but you're going to be traveling or whatever, you're not sure your hotel's going to have a weight room, or if you're staying at a friend's house, you're not sure they have access to weights, you don't want to go pay for a gym, you may not have it in your schedule. Carrying a sack of bands with you takes up very, very little space, especially if you know, like if you've been using them and you know what you need. You can just pack the ones that you need, and that way you can get in some quick stuff along with some good calisthenics while you're traveling, or if you need to take a break from the iron or the machines or whatever, and you just want to do something different. Bands are super useful. They're not terribly expensive. They're extremely useful. Their primary benefit, other than portability and inexpense, is power training, not necessarily strength, definitely not hypertrophy, but actual explosive power. So use them for what they're right for, and you'll find a lot of benefit. I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.